Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Morning. It's like Pratham is here. Amanda, Morgan, and Jesse.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning. All right. So there we go. How was everyone?
Pretty good. And this week for you too, I think, probably.
What this week in Embodied Intelligence, or?
Well, that, and we had a bunch of Google Summer of Code meetings, Prediction and Futures meetings, had Demo one. Been busy for you too.
Yeah. It's been a busy week. We had a lot of people coming into the Slack. I met with several people about Summer of Code projects, and so we should be rolling along. The application portal is now open, so people can, we're getting within about 2 or 3 weeks of 2 weeks of submitting proposals. So this is the time for people to kind of get together their proposals. And I have offered people to present or to send them to me so I can give them an idea of what's in, what should be in the proposal, what makes for a good proposal, and so forth. So so far, I think Raja has sent me one, and I think Pratham has sent me one, and I've gone over them, and nothing has looked bad. I mean, it's just I just want to make sure people are on the right track, basically. So, and we've talked about some of the ways that the proposal should be in previous meetings. So that's all I'm going to say about that for now. Looks like Jesse's got the Notion up. So do you have a link for that you can put in the chat or in the Slack?
Yeah, it's in Slack.
Okay.
We always try to put it in Slack, but it's in Slack.
All right.
All right. I'm sneeze. Hold on.
Okay. So anyone have any other updates that they want to give? Weekly updates, Amanda or Morgan or Raj or Pratham? Anyone?
I wasn't able to go to everything at the Embodied Intelligence conference, but I went to a few things in a couple of the breakout rooms, and it was neat. And I have, we can talk about this later, but I really liked Anil Seth's talk on like predictive processing and interoception, and I thought what the work he was doing fell pretty neatly into the category of neurophenomenology, which is obviously relevant to the cognition futures work.
Yeah.
So yeah, we can talk about that later though. No other updates really for me.
Okay. Well, yeah, thanks. I saw that he was presenting, and of course he does a lot of stuff on consciousness, but there's a lot of interchange between consciousness and neurophenomenology. Okay, Thank you, Amanda. Looks like Raj wants to say something. An update.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, so this week I was just checking the various alternatives of NetLogo that would be feasible for our use case. I came across few options. There were NISA, there was something called AgentScript and Atomic Agents, to name a few. I looked into all of them in depth to analyze their feasibility for our use case. I even checked their GitHub repositories to see how active they are. Out of all of them, NISA seemed to be the best fit to me, as it's a Python library and the models are written in Python itself. So integrating the models in a web interface via Django or Flask should also be pretty much easy. Apart from that, NISA, I also noticed, is a very actively maintained project and consistently participating in GSOC under the umbrella organization NumFocus. I also had a discussion regarding all this with Bradley to see if all this would be fine or not. Apart from that, I also refactored my proposal and had it reviewed. And yeah, that's it. And there was one thing which I wanted to ask. That is, like after our meeting yesterday, like few of the pointers, like getting the insights not only from GitHub but various other sources, like as you had mentioned, Slack or Discord or however it may be. I personally felt that the vision of the project is kind of huge than what is described in NeuroStars. So I wanted to see if like I could have a meeting with Bradley and Jesse, just to how should I put it? Just like juice out and just see what all I could be delivering this summer, the pinpoint requirements, rather than like I promise many things and I'm unable to do those. I just promise like these things and basically set a realistic goal for my proposal. That's it. So I wanted to see if I could have a meeting with Bradley and Jesse regarding the same.
Yeah.
Before I submit my proposal.
Yeah. I think that's good. But I mean, I guess my take on that is that we, it's pretty broad for a reason. And that is that we don't like to see people just kind of figure out kind of what they can do out of like this whole umbrella. So I don't want you to propose anything that you can't deliver, but I think like some of the stuff that you've proposed is perfectly doable over the summer. And sometimes people have to rescope their projects. Like last summer we did that, and it's not something you want to do, but it's something that if you can't do something, then that's what we do. But I think you're on the right track with a lot of the agent-based, like, so you've looked into MISA and that toolbox, and I think that's going to be a place where you can probably spend a lot of time on this summer. You might also spend some time on the web interface. I think those are all doable. I don't think those are out of reach. So, maybe someone else will propose for the same project, but they'll do different things. They'll have different types of contributions to make. And so that's okay. I just, I don't think when I looked at your proposal, I don't think I saw anything that was outlandish in terms of what you were proposing. So I don't think it's too much of a problem, although we can talk about that more if you want this week sometime.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you.
I would basically just add on to that by saying the descriptions for particularly, I don't want to say just our Google Summer of Code, but like the descriptions for the Google Summer of Codes have to be they have to incorporate a lot of wiggle room. And it's not really it's not like an explicit assignment where you're graded against a specific outcome or even a finite limited set of outcomes that you have to basically produce. It's very much in the developmental, like what you're writing this proposal, and this is a little bit of a meta commentary, I suppose, but like you're writing this proposal, then you're going to go through the proposal, that you lay out and have this, roadmap. But it's I think there's sort of a valid. I'm kind of stepping away, and I'm in project management land when I say this. So I guess I'll say to address the question. I think you're on the right track in that sense. So just defer to Bradley to have a little bit more of a zoomed out comment about this in general, because I'm as my background is like right now, I'm super involved in like all sorts of drafting, all kinds of proposals and suggested ways of doing things, and then just the disparity between that and what it's like when you start doing it you can do so a lot of the work you can start doing now and have been doing, like anybody in Google Summer Code can do that now, but also like just as the harder things develop in the actual time frame you're trying to work within, things will change, and that's okay. And I think I don't know if Google Summer of Code emphasizes that enough, in that a lot of the real like learning experience is that, in my opinion. Like it's not how to write a perfect proposal. It's literally what happens when a proposal isn't working. How do you resolve that? How do you make choices that are under a general time pressure and what can you get out pressure? What can you do pressure? And I think that's basically the real. I don't know how that's really marketed in Google Summer of Code generally, because at least in my experience, Google Summer of Code is like, hey, write a proposal, do a cool project, do the project, and then you're done. I feel like a major learning part of that whole process is actually like the conversation between your stakeholders, which in this case is mostly Bradley and me in the lab, and you as a developer, or you as any generative person in the process, and then like constantly dialoguing between, here's the plan, here's where I am, here's the problem, what are your expectations? Like that's really what Google Summer of Code teaches you beyond just like, oh, I learned some more coding stuff. And I think that's like that is basically the foundation of all of your future jobs. Like whether it's volunteer stuff like plot twisters, whether it's working in a lab, whether it's having an industry job, like that discussion is how you survive and bring people to where you want them to go with your work too. So I know that's a little big picture, lofty discussion, but I think it's important. So I'll defer to Bradley about cleaning it up.
Yeah, I mean, I presented last summer at the Google Summer of Code Mentor event, and I presented our sort of approach to it, which is more, maybe educational and stresses some of these fundamentals more than other groups. So other groups, it's like you come in and you address some pull requests, or they might dump some code on you, and I like to stress in this organization, sort of the community period, and then sort of this dialogue between the person doing the project and the stakeholders. Usually we'll do a group. We're going to probably do another set of group meetings this summer where, everyone doing Google Summer of Code in between the two projects are going to, talk about what they're interested in, their progress, and then we'll, kind of get into some further. Just like, so last summer we did the open source sustainability, and we talked about all sorts of things. Like we talked about how to solve a certain problem, or how to address a certain issue. And there were of course problems during the coding period where people would be stuck on something, and we'd have to kind of come to kind of think about it together as to how to solve this problem. So there's a lot of that, and I like to stress that sort of thing where we have, a regular dialogue, as Jesse said. And I think that's a good set of skills, because that's what you'll be doing in development and in general in your career. So I think that's a good way to think about it. And it's, again, it doesn't have to be, you don't want to rescope your entire project, but you will rescope parts of it likely, because once you get into it, there are going to be things problems you run into. You need to be quick in changing your approach. You don't want to just like say, well, I'm going to do something else entirely, although, that can happen. And you're kind of scoping out everything now. So, kind of what's there and what might work best. And, if that works out, great, but sometimes it won't. And so, there's going to be this dialogue. So, yeah.
Yeah. And to make this, I guess I'm making this also an impromptu, like semi hashtag professional development session on my commentary. And as you kind of saw, I'm going to eventually set up a meeting next week. We didn't have time this week, basically, but I'm going to have like a wrap session. And anybody who wants to join could join, but it's basically going to be me talking to Bradley about project management, like this kind of stuff specifically, particularly with an emphasis on like interdisciplinary research or like project management and like research idea concept development, project development, because putting on my professional development hat and putting on my mentor hat and putting on my, like, I'll briefly say a few things in my introduction before we go into this. We're kind of moving on to, this. I'll go through this timeline in a moment, but still in the kind of introduction space, I'll just say, like, I'm not going to go into many details, but what I'll say is, like, in many different arenas in my life right now, I am like at one of my groups that I'm working with, the priority just majorly shifted from find and do things that would come into being at this timeline, like let's say a few years out, versus another timeline, because we want to focus on this other part of the timeline that could be implemented differently or faster in a certain way, while not losing the former, but shifting to, we need things that are in this location. And now, like understanding really clearly where the why the pressure for the changes in priorities happens is such a big thing to do. And, like, a lot of that is just having access to discussions. But, like, I think it's such a critical thing to realize that when priorities change, you have the right to create a dialogue about why they're changing. There was a really great chart some months ago, and I don't remember where it is, but, like, the role of, like, actually, it was from NICWIC 2020. I wonder if it's in here. It was from NICWIC 2022 last year. Is it? I don't know. I don't know if it's going to be. Yeah. I don't know where the notes are for that page, but basically at this event, last year's version of the event we're presenting at, someone was kind of taking us through her career as a tech worker and saying, one thing I wish people told me was, like, this very explicit sense of who can I ask things for. Like, if someone is my mentor, if someone is my direct supervisor that I report to, if someone is my colleague, what are the different things that you can, like, oh, they're not going to show up here. Oh well. What are the different things you can get from and expect from and glean from them and like, talk about to them and whatever. And, like, how do you do that? So, like, that's super important and relevant. But also, like, just to kind of zoom out again to other groups I'm working with, like, we've kind of had to have a discussion where, how is it that we as an executive team decide whose help we need and who's offering us help that we have to say to them, hey, you can't really help us right now. And there's specific reasons why. And like the decision process for how that is managed and mitigated and explained to somebody, you may not always get very good feedback for why, and not necessarily being fired from a job, but saying you can't work on this project with us, or you can't, like, all the decisions about why what you're producing and tailoring what you're producing to what needs to happen. Like, I feel like that's literacy of those conversations is immensely valuable. Like, that is the ultimate transferable skill, because it doesn't matter what project you're on. It doesn't matter if you're leading or if you're following or whatever. Like understanding how to do that is like the point of interface for all, like, for everything. Like, even if you're just like a one person, like, one-stop shop for development and marketing and everything, whatever, like, you'll have to interface with people at some point. So anyway, I know I'm kind of being super broad in my discussions for what's going on, and I'm happy to if people have questions about this, I guess I'll say this: if people have any questions about this sort of thing, you say, Jesse, I know this is important, but I don't know what the heck you're talking about, or how it applies to Google Summer Code or my life, or a situation at work, a situation with your talking to your lab. You can please ask us. Like I know Bradley's really great about that. I ask Bradley all the time, hey, can I talk to you about the situation that I'm dealing with somewhere else? Like, we're here to help with that too. So I want to make sure, like, you are not expected to know this, particularly for interns or people coming through for the first time Google Summer Code, people aren't familiar with the lab. Like we're part of what we try to do explicitly, and part of like the mentoring program at JoPro that I'm helping flesh out. Like we want, like, these are early career, but like not just early, but like whole career, entire career research skills that aren't always talked about. And so we're trying to make that a bit explicit. But oops, I'm on the wrong part here. But yeah, that's enough of a broad summary for now. We can move on to other things. But any immediate questions from that before we move on to other stuff? I will go through this chart. We can finally, it's time to put this into the, I've taken a couple notes. Oh no, not as much notes here. It was, I took notes someplace else. Oh no, actually I didn't get to take a lot of notes in Notion yet because I've been so busy with this event. But as far as our project board, congratulations to everybody in the lab, Bradley and Amanda and me and the lab who's contributed to that, because everybody contributed to that, especially condition future stuff, but we're now in the done category. So
good.
I think all of these things, I'll have to put all these in done too, that's fine. So they'll disappear magically. And I set up a nice filter where this will go away. It's cool, but I didn't realize, I didn't know if that doing the top one would take away all these other ones or not. But yeah, it's like you have to send them together to the next
To the crypt.
world.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. There we go. And I guess fittingly, Nicola is now at the top of the list, which is basically going to be my major focus. That's basically down here. But as we've talked about, Google Summer Code applications are officially open. So yeah, we're done with the pre-summer period. So close that out too. I don't know if there's anything subtitles here. But
What's the pre-summer period?
What's that?
What's the pre-summer period? Oh, I guess before
like
the
everything before the application opened up.
Okay, yeah.
So now we're in, I guess, I don't know what you want to call this one, but
well, I think, yeah, well, we're kind of
just like,
the application period is kind of coming to an end. It'll be done in about a week and a half. But we can like think forward towards like, you know, see how many slots we get, and then, you know, planning for the summer itself. So we need to plan out the community period and like, you know, figure out how we want to do the weekly meetings, which, you know, we'll, like last summer we had an open source meeting that was separate from this meeting. So do things like that.
What's the actual start date of the summer? Like, does it start May? Like, when is the actual like
I think early May, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know.
Yeah, it begins on May 4th, the community bonding period, until May 28th.
Okay.
And from May 28th, the official bonding period begins.
Yeah. So that's like that.
It's just like when are people accepted? Like, when's the acceptance?
The 4th. I think the 4th is when.
Okay, yeah.
And then and then it goes through basically September.
Are all of the projects, I know, I think some projects are like this many hours, this many days, and there's another one that's more hours, or are they all the same length this year, or I forget?
I think no, there are two. There's a long project and a short project. I think the open source sustainability is a 350-hour project, and the VR is a shorter project, 175. I think. But if it's 175, then you're expected to do 20 hours of work a week for the period. And then 350 is like 40 hours a week for that period. And you're expected to do it within that time, but I think you can, if necessary, you can delay. You can ask for an extension. They did that last year. I don't know what they're doing this year, but and so that's the plan. And so we're gonna have these events throughout the summer where we can interact and.
Okay. Oops, I just here. Yeah. So suffice to say,
The BICA 2023 has been accepted, or it's been submitted. So that's awaiting acceptance, I guess. Okay.
There we go. It should be like yeah, I might change that a bit later. Anyway, let's just go through what's on the list here. Bond will kind of be something we focus on after NICWIC because these are all waiting basically clarity. Do we want to say anything about the competition? Like, do we want to focus on that in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, well, I mean, like my head's finally come up from like a lot of the papers and things that have been going on in the EI workshop, and I'm still working on the NICWIC, my part of that presentation, but I think I'm almost done with that. So I'll probably be coming back to that soon, probably this week even, and so that'll be coming up. But
have you heard anything about a NeuroMatch? I know there's NeuroMatch Academy, but is there a conference?
I think it's probably in the fall. I don't think last year was in the fall, the year before, so.
I know applications. Well, I'll put this here. I'll just put this here. Just take a screenshot of it. Basically, it's the end of March, and it will be in July. So for those who want to apply to that, that's what that is. But
can you describe it for new people, what that is?
What's that?
Can you describe what that is for new people?
Well, NeuroMatch at the conference is something that sort of popped up after the pandemic when Society for Neuroscience, CompSci, all these sort of brain and mind conferences went away. So in 2020, there was a bunch of people coming together, a lot of people just made an online conference. From that conference series, there's been about, I think, 5 so far, at least 5 conferences since 2020. The last 2 years, there's been less because there's been less demand and the normal conferences have returned in, I think 2020, was it 2022 or 2021? They also made a summer academy, which is focused mainly on computational neuroscience. They have also ordered a different course or set of coursework for deep learning. I'm not sure what they're going to do this year because this year they might have changed things a little bit differently, but they've basically found this niche and it kind of made their own company now that there's a president and a lot more defined stuff saying, okay, I think they're basically focused on an annual summer school and maybe 1 conference a year now. But it's basically about the training is in computational stuff, like deep learning and computational neuroscience and interpreting the data and running different models in that sense. The conferences are quite wide-ranging. The conferences are philosophy, psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, maybe some robotics stuff too. It's kind of a more neuroscience-leaning version of the Embodied Intelligence workshop, was very interdisciplinary. So that's kind of very open conference, a little bit more technically tailored summer school.
Yeah. So we've been participating in different ways over the last couple of years. One thing we like to do is like we've been trying to establish what they call a slow pod. So Neuromatch Academy is the summer school where all the materials are open. So they have the computational neuroscience one and then the deep learning one. So there are two foci for like the materials. Computational neuroscience is more about how the brain, how you apply computational models to the brain, to the neural world. And then the deep learning course is doing deep learning, applying deep learning to different problems. So we had a couple people take the deep learning course, a couple people take the computational neuroscience course. They're different, but they're very, very good. I think the materials, you can really get, they kind of give you a high level, but they also do deep dives into certain topics. And then you do a project. So we've been trying to be, involved in that in different ways. Last year, I did a recap each week of the materials as people went through them. So we'll probably do that again this year. We also have, I've mentored for some of the project groups, and of course Jesse's done the course, and a couple other people in the, we've had several people in the organization do the course, and even serve as TAs for the course.
Yeah, I would emphasize the Neuromatch Academy and the conference are extremely accessibility driven. Although I would say I think there's a little bit more sort of, now that the academy is structured a bit more, I think there's a little bit more. I don't think they've turned people away, but I think that it might be a little bit harder to be a TA now, for example. But like there's a lot of, they try very, 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 like the most I've actually seen anybody. Like they try to do special workarounds for people in places like China that have very limited access to things, because they can't use like Google or whatever stuff there, or certain ways of accessing where the notebooks are stored and stuff like that. So they're very accessibility focused. But if you're interested at all, check it out. And also there is a Neuromatch channel on Slack, and please ask us if you have questions about that. It's a great opportunity and a great way to make network and connect with people in that area. So I would really encourage it if you're. It's also like kind of a nice thing to do. Like if you're not sure what your simultaneous are going to be, apply to Neuromatch, and you have a pretty good chance of getting in, because they try not to turn people away if at all possible. But it's a nice sort of like backup or auxiliary plan. It's also really good to show that you completed the professional development certificate training course for your CV, or you go to grad school, or whatever you want to throw on there. It's not a bad thing to have. So it's my plug for Neuromatch.
Yeah.
Yeah, we covered Google Summer of Code. Nick Week is going to be up next. I made this here because, like, I don't even, on a slightly personal note, like, I have the most, I feel like people in the front line, I feel like people at, like, We Robot, I'm going to try to share my screen to make it a little bit easier for me to, like,
But you're already sharing your screen.
Bounce around a bit more.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was just sharing like the Notion window though, not everything. You can see this?
Yes.
Okay. I feel like all the people at like We Robot. Also, We Robot is coming out again. It's gonna be here in Boston. Oh, that's big news. It's gonna be here in Boston, and that's just like, cool for me. But like, where did you come from? Oh, it's going to be behind you can go through all these tweets for yeah, I'm very excited about it's in Boston this year. So that's great. For a robot. And that's me. Okay. Let's check this out. Oh. So part of why I thought, oh, and the Media Lab too. I didn't realize that. Cool. Part of why I'm, oh, what? Abstracts are due in 2 days? What? Well, I'll be doing that today.
All right.
The thing about We Robot is that it's one of those awful things where, where it's literally 6 months down the road from your paper to the abstract. So I'm so glad I looked today. I thought it was so much later, but anyway. So I'll be immediately doing that this weekend.
All right.
So it's due Monday, basically.
All right, yeah.
Okay. Well, interesting. This is great. Anyway, why I'm bringing these up is because I obviously love the event, but also like everybody who goes to this event, I feel like is literally on the front line of like these are the people who are trying to have some coherent way to manage society while GPT has an app store now. And I'm not an alarmist in the sense of skies falling, but I just know being in like serious discussions at MIT's AI ethics reading group, going to We Robot, going to the people who are very seriously trying to work at real things, like where like what is the situation right now? Oops, sorry. What is the take away all hype. Just like, where's the law right now? Where's the technology right now as interfacing with the law? Like, just real talk. What are we doing? What can we do? What can we push forward or not? Like, that space is so challenging. And I just feel like, I don't know, like,
Yeah.
we're gonna be talking about this at NICWIC and all that, and a big like Ankit's like flash talk is going to be about generative stuff, specifically GDP, DALL-E, and all that. But it's just like I feel feel good about what we're talking about at the event, but on a level of like what these people have to deal with.
Yeah.
Like I was like, oh my god, like, like I don't think people realize how like challenging their life and career and vocation is directly. Like, if you're going to try to make, like, you're going to make choices that are just so impossible to make about what to try to do. Anyway, I'll pull back from that. But yeah, so bonus.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's bonus. Any comments about any of this stuff before we go on to the conference?
And so you'll be corralling our NICWIC presentations soon, I imagine.
Oh yeah, I like Ankit's done a lot of that stuff. I have to put it into the master spreadsheet. I know Ankit's gonna have had their his like slide, talking about his slides. The biggest thing, honestly, for NICWIC is Brian and kind of corralling him and saying, hey, Brian, what do you want to do? Because I can speak poorly on his behalf if need be. I know he said he wanted to go. For NICWIC, by the way, registrations are open if anybody wants to go. I think Brian's like the only local person, so everybody else can kind of, it's not virtual, and I'm trying to help them with that so much, but like we're really not virtual at all right now, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So it'll be recorded ish, but like I'm trying to get, I've got to see what Brian's going to do with that. Outside of that, like, if for some reason Brian can't do anything with it, like, we can just expand Alan stuff. And I guess for you, Bradley, like, I'm not quite sure. Were you?
I'm working on a presentation, or some slides. I'm not.
Okay.
It's like going to be, within the time limit, but.
Yeah, because like I didn't know if you wanted to have like kind of like overview stuff again, or like did you want to lead off first, or how are you envisioning your contribution?
Well, I mean, I could lead off because my slides are kind of like getting into this open source sustainability, but I'm doing more pointed questions this time, so I'm kind of like posing some questions within the slides, and I'm not really I'm talking a little bit about what we did in GSOC, but not that much. But that's fine because there's some things I want to do with this open source sustainability. I want to unfurl some of these themes a little bit more. So that's what I'll be doing. Probably not what Brian's planning to do. So.
Yeah, cool. And Jen's been doing a lot of work in this area already. There's not everything to show this week. Maybe next week we can try to have like a semi-dry run of things.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. More about that soon. I'm gonna have to step away for like a couple, like 5 minutes or so.
All right.
But I don't know if we want to just talk. Maybe we can take a deeper dive into the conference, or Manny can talk about what she wrote here. So
yeah.
I don't know if you guys want to share your screen or not either. Like, what do you want to be on the screen? Or you just want this on the screen?
Do you want to talk a little bit, Amanda? Or?
Yeah, if you just keep that.
Okay, well, I'll do that. I'm just gonna mute myself and right back. Go ahead. Great. Thank you, everybody.
Oh, pull up the Notion. You're not sharing the Notion. Yeah, there we go. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so I mean, Anil Seth was like the one main talk that I was able to go to, but I really enjoyed it. So I copied his abstract here. There's a kind of a lot going on, but I liked his description of the hard problem of consciousness versus the real problem. So the hard problem is like Chalmers's philosophical stance that like we can never fully explain consciousness. But then Seth describes the real problem as basically the kind of thing that neurophenomenology can make progress on. So like having first personal reports act as input for like empirical science, and then vice versa, having like scientific paradigms help inform a first personal methodology like meditation or phenomenological reduction. So he talked about like that dialogue can actually lead us somewhere interesting, even if it doesn't solve this philosophical problem. And then he talked about what he called, and what I've seen other people call, computational neurophenomenology. So using computational models as a kind of bridge between the first personal phenomenology and the third personal measures, like EEG dynamics, for example. So one thing that he talked about was a project where he used different kinds of neural nets that simulated various kinds of like visual distortions or hallucinations by like he like messed with something, like changed a parameter at various levels in this, I think they were neural nets, some kind of computational model of vision. So you like mess with the parameter at different levels, and then you generate like different distorted images. And what I thought was like most interesting and what made it actually like neurophenomenology is he then asked people who had experienced different visual distortions for whatever reason, like illness. I don't think he talked about psychedelics, but that would be an interesting candidate to examine as well. But asked people who had experienced these visual distortions, like which AI generated one matches like best with their experience, to try to connect the computational model to various like atypical like brain activity in these different people. So there's this dialogue between first personal and not quite third personal, like this computational. Like when I say third personal, I've been thinking like EEG or fMRI, more like traditionally scientific measures. So this computational modeling level is interesting, but the goal is for that to like be able to make contact with the third personal measures. So that was neat. I also liked how he was looking within the framework of predictive processing. And as I was listening to his talk, I thought like the impact of like top-down expectations that predictive processing is like based on can be seen as like exactly why first personal methods need to be trained and like made more rigorous. So there's like a term of art in phenomenology that like called like bracketing, like suspending judgment basically. And I think that the top-down influence in predictive processing is like exactly the kind of thing that needs to be bracketed for like phenomenological practice and like the development of the first personal method. So just as like an interesting contrast between his talk and then our like embodied neurophenomenology project, he was like leaning into this top-down influence and he thought it was like essential to our perception of the world, which I think is true. But that doesn't, maybe that's like a distinction between our like natural attitude and then this like reflective phenomenological reduction, like mindfulness practice kind of attitude that Varela describes and on becoming aware, like when you try to set aside those expectations. Yeah, so those were the two main things from his talk that I found really interesting. And then I also really liked in the breakout room, there was this talk on whether ChatGPT-3 was really disembodied, which I thought was a neat question. And I don't have much more to say about that one.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I was actually there too.
Yeah.
So do you really think it was, he kind of played with this idea of embodiment as like, I can't remember how he defined it, but it wasn't in the typical way that we define it with, like in neuroscience or with agents. It was kind of like if you have a sensory stream or something like that. So what was your opinion of his take on embodiment as like the framing sort of definition of that?
Yeah, so he cited that one paper, Wilson, I think, on the 6 views of embodied cognition.
Right.
That was what he was really basing it on. And I haven't gone back to that, but I remember reading that and thinking that like it was missing something, because it also like talks about embodiment as meaning like, oh, you get like sensory motor input from the world. It was like a very minimal view of embodiment maybe. So when he was arguing that this chatbot is embodied, it like kind of made sense with this not very intuitive definition of embodiment. So yeah, my intuition is definitely that like, no, definitely not. This bot is not embodied, but like I like the definition of embodiment where it does require a tangible body. So that's one thing he was talking about, was the difference between embodiment and having a tangible body, this idea of tangibility.
Right.
And I just think that obviously embodiment requires a tangible body. Maybe it could be a hardware robot body, maybe, but definitely not, something intangible.
Right. Yeah, I guess, it depends on what you mean by tangible. Like, could it be like, like a shell, or like a piece of hardware, or, is it like a set of sensors in the environment? Or, I guess it could be like it's kind of interesting because, I've been thinking about like embodiment and agents. And one of the things you find is that, of course, you have the body itself, and you have the benefit of that is you have sensors in different locations on the body. So there's a spatial aspect of embodiment. And I don't think people talk about that very much, but this is something I was thinking of when we were going through some of the papers that I've been working on. That there's a spatial aspect. So like, if you are getting information from your left hand side versus your right hand side, does that lead to some bias in processing? Or if you're getting information, if you have eyes, a good example is like animals that have eyes. Like a lot of animals will have eyes on the sides of their head. And then, some animals have eyes that face forward, and, that sort of thing. So you have like this type of sensory input that allows you to see different views of the world. So like in horses, their eyes are on the sides of their head, and their visual field is like split between the left and the right hand side. And, in humans, we have our eyes in the front in a lot of primates, so we can see forward, but not necessarily on each side. And so that makes a difference in how you view the world as well. So, I mean, I don't know, like a lot of the definitions of embodiment to me seem like they just kind of loop around like the operational definition, which is like, what does this mean? Like, what do we have to do to build something that's embodied? Just some thoughts that I had.
I'll mute myself here. Yeah, that's kind of getting what I was actually. I'll pull this up here. I'm starting to see embodiment as constraints. Like I think one thing we could explore really nicely in the reading group and in future discussions is another way to think about embodiment. And I guess I didn't see this talk about imagination, action, and San Altman from OpenAI. I suppose we have a discussion about does AGI need sense or whatever. I didn't go to this event directly. One of my friends, Dan Elton, who's now here in Boston with me, we go to different events sometimes about like nerd stuff like this. And he went. I'd asked him like, "Hey, what did you think of it?" But he didn't get back to me yet. But outside of that, I'm specifically thinking like embodiment kind of is what's the degree of deviation if you were just to say constraints? Like if you replaced embodiment with constraints outright, like I think also like I guess I should like ADRT, like we had a nice discussion about this. I think we had a discussion about this Wednesday, right? Did we mention it there?
We may have, but I don't remember what it was. Oh yeah, I think
we mentioned it recently, but about how like there's sort of this need for the mapping. Yeah, kind of like here it is. This isomorphic or not, controller versus controlled. The controlled must be mapped to the controller. And I feel like I don't think I'm not really saying EGRT is like the consciousness theory, but I think there's sort of I really like Lisa Feldman Barrett's kind of take on like the brain evolved, and Lisa Feldman Barrett and Thomas Fuchs are coming up a lot. Like Patricia is a little more familiar with Lisa Feldman Barrett, and I'm a little more familiar with Thomas Fuchs because we've spent the last few months reading his book. Like explicitly, slowly. So it's sort of this: where do they align and where they don't align? I don't really know, but there's a lot of I'm doing a lot of like translating between the two to an extent. And I really like Lisa Feldman Barrett take that the brain evolved to control a body or to manipulate a body. I'm hesitant to use control in the sense of the way that regulator control it, because I'm not quite sure that's exactly what it is. I don't think it's precise. I think it's more of a like a funnel that's being filtered into of sorts. But anyway, where am I going with this? I'm going with this in that I think a fun thing to look at would be, how do we understand the concept of constraints in terms of the constraints of an embodiment, and how do we talk about like I guess we've talked about like mutually informed constraints in other contexts here, but just like how do embodiments almost like, I don't want to say, let's catalog all the different kinds of embodiments that affect the constraints, but more like understanding something in that space about, I'll leave it at that. Do I think ChatGPT is embodied? I really wish I was at the talk, so I can't say a lot more. I think and I guess I'll ask you guys, you both, since you've seen this, but like, was he trying to say that, was he getting at all about how the very nature of the input data itself that ChatGPT has been fed and grown upon is embodied in a particular sense, or like was embodied as it was processed? Or is he not getting into that angle of it?
No, not really. It seemed like the input just counted as like the environment, and he didn't say much about that. At least I don't remember.
Like the screen that its outputs are printed on, or what did he mean by environment? Like, he didn't say environment at all.
No, I don't think he. It was a bit more philosophical, at least in terms of the argument. But it's still like, yeah, I guess you could say like language is inherently embodied in a lot of ways, but actually it maybe not. I mean, that's a good question.
Well,
Like, because people, would say, well, language learning is embodied. Like, you have to ground language or whatever, and then it's produced, and then ChatGPT is just picking it up and training its model. But the thing is that that's where the context is. So if you just take text and you put it into a model, and there's no embodiment in the processing of all that, then you're left with something that's disembodied, I guess.
And that's a little bit what I'm getting at. Slightly impression in the first part of what you said, like the comprehension stuff from Wednesday and the constraint stuff is sort of like, there maybe is a difference between the comprehenders and the information to be comprehended and the constraints that are at play, So anyway, we should probably keep it rolling. This is kind of a funny thing. I really like this, that Josh Bondurard comes out as a hallucinist. How do you want to say that?
That like consciousness is an illusion.
Illusionist. That's the right way to say it, yeah. And then you kind of see this here. Cool talk, real cool. Cool talk, real cool.
Amanda's talk. There's Jesse's talk.
Yeah, this is it here. And I liked, because I was like, okay, this is great. Let's encourage this as much as possible. It's like, I came out today. I'm an illusionist. It didn't go well. Did it not go well? I don't remember what happened.
Oh,
when that
he was
happened.
just joking around.
Anil was like, "Oh, are you really?"
Yeah, I think he was joking around,
but yeah. And then Anil was like, this year. So
yeah.
But I like that. My one like on this is actually Anil Seth is like, yeah, there was something about lowering or raising to the level of philosophy, and I was like, yeah, like this is like let's make this like, this is the whole, like, I feel like, like these aren't dirty little secrets that we have to talk about in the back room. Oh, like politically and in the funding sense, yes, I get why we have to be careful about how we say things, but at the same time, like Josh Vanguard, I think conscious is an illusion. Like, yeah, like put it out there. Like that's I know we can't really do that in a particular way, but like being really explicit about, I'm approaching this work kind of with like that's informing or leaning me to believe in this view. I feel like that's super relevant, but we kind of have weird ways of talking about that. So
illusionism is a nonsense position, Amanda.
It certainly can seem that way.
Yeah.
To some people maybe not. I think that's all I had from this conference. But there's other, cool stuff for sure. Tech law and policy never needed more help.
Yeah.
GCP can now, like, you can ask it to clip videos and do stuff. So anyway, cool.
Right.
Anything we wanted to talk about, like the Kairos lab or next steps, what to do here? I feel like we could do a much bigger summary of this. Like we should write something about the event. I want to write something about the event, but I haven't.
I think we should do a blog post. I might do a blog post just like highlighting our talks. Like, Amanda, if you can record your talk and don't worry about like how involved everything is. I just wanted to have like the talks, in one place and so people can see them, and then I'll put a blog post together on them.
You did a great job, Amanda.
Yeah, you did. You did a great job.
You handled the language and you had a lot of precision, and I think that was well done.
Yeah.
So. Thanks. I'm not good at talking quickly, and I was worried about time.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, I'll record it. By the end of today, I can do that.
Okay, and don't worry about the time so much because we have freedom now. Okay, yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's why I wanted to actually record it so I can talk at a slower pace and include some things that I didn't say in the conference.
Yeah, I think when you're doing philosophy, it's like you have to give it a little bit of time to unpack things, or when you're doing theory too, it's like there are a lot of words and things. I think that's so then maybe if Jesse, you want to make a bigger blog post about some of the topics, or we could use this as like a template. The Kairos lab is interesting. This is I can't remember his name, Val Gannon, or something like that, and he does this. He's an independent researcher, and he does a lot of, and so he's involved in the Active Inference Institute as well as doing independent research, and he's got a lot of interesting stuff. So I mean, it's like that's something that if you
what was his talk on? I can't
remember exactly, but it was there was a woman who talked, I think, before Amanda, and I don't know if Amanda remembers that talk, but I think that was those two together were in that talk. So
yeah, I remember hers. I don't really remember his, but hers was about like how the social level of operations can act as a constraint.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Let me stop this for a second. We kind of covered a lot we covered conditioned futures, ecology of the brain. We're pretty much at the end of the book. A lot's going on there. A lot of. I think the workshop will inform a lot of cool stuff ahead. I'm quite happy about where we are, but it's going to take some project management work to build everything out for the future, and I'm very thankful for those who come along for that. I think the general course ahead is going to be structuring the project a bit more, and then like getting to a place where we can kind of have a little more like direct call for involvement, because right now it's similar to Plotter's. Like right now we're kind of at a transition state when you just crystallize what we've built out. Like we kind of, and then kind of the presentation, there's a paper that can easily come from that. There's a lot of things we have like at a developmental like fork in the road that we need to crystallize and push forward. But it's going well. We can, as usual, people can come to the Wednesday meetings if they want to, or ask about that if they're interested. I put on a list A-Life 2023 here, but I don't know if we have anything to say about that yet. Like we're kind of still waiting to hear from that, or any updates, I guess.
Yeah, still waiting. Actually, I'm going to share my screen.
Okay.
I want to move on to like some of the other stuff here. Talk about the project management course.
Ready to go to the new business.
So yeah, let me share my screen here, and so yeah, to wrap up on the EI workshop, we had 3 talks. This was Jesse's talk. It was in the Thursday breakout session, and this is Methods and Philosophy for Embodied Cognition. So this is an update on the Cognition Futures group, which we were talking about just now. And so that was a talk, and then Amanda had a talk on embodied neurophenomenology, and this was in the same session, and this was a very good talk. It had sort of encompassed a lot of philosophy and philosophical issues on neurophenomenology. So, and then my talk, which was on Wednesday, which was on critical periods as developmental neurosimulation. And this is about the developing agents and talking about critical periods in development. And so that was the 3rd talk that we did. So we had 3 talks in the group. I think that was great that we had that many contributions. And so we were well represented. This is the talk I gave, and I wanted to talk about something. We talked about constraints. We're talking about constraints here. And I brought up this slide in the talk, and this is from the manuscript that, the critical periods manuscript that I think I talked about last week. So this is a diagram that shows these critical periods, and I've defined them in 2 ways. You have morphogenetic critical periods and behavioral critical periods. Morphogenetic critical periods are critical periods where different parts of the phenotype emerge. So it could be like a set of eyes or a set of appendages like end effectors like hands or feet. It could be other types of things like the parts of the connectome. And then you have these behavioral critical periods, which are the emergence of like acquiring behaviors or information from the environment. And so the idea here is that you have this contingency map where some morphogenetic critical periods are important to put these behavioral critical periods in place. So you can't really learn anything about the environment if you don't have like a pair of eyes or a sensor that will allow you to take information in from the environment. You have M1 and M2, which are 2 different morphogenetic critical periods. So you could have, for example, a set of eyes emerge, and then maybe a set of end effectors emerge that has allows you to feel your environment, and then pressure sensing and things like that. And then both of those would contribute to the acquisition of environmental information in this behavioral critical period. And so if you say don't have eyes, or those eyes don't develop during this critical period, then only this critical period can contribute to the behavioral acquisition, and so that affects the behavioral critical period. There's also duration and amplitude, which the duration and amplitude of the morphogenetic critical period contributes then to the behavioral critical period upstream, and it affects acquisition there. So that's how. This is one way to think about like critical periods and how they're connected. and how you get this cascade of things in development. I had a question after the talk, someone asking, is there a feedback between different critical periods? And I thought about it and I said, well, this is supposed to be a directional map, but certainly, like, so, this goes in this direction. So this isn't really a feedback loop here between B1, B2, and M4. But it could very well be a feedback. You could have feedbacks. And there's this idea called cycles of contingency, which is from developmental systems theory. And the argument there is that you have feedback loops in development, and you have feedbacks between contingencies. So, you have one set of contingencies, like the formation of eyes. And then that affects the behavioral critical period downstream, which is the acquisition of visual information. Now, that information can be, if you're acquiring things during that behavioral critical period, it can affect maybe the morphogenetic aspect of it, in the sense that it might affect, there might be adaptation in the eye during that critical period, which then affects like things later in that critical period window. So the critical period is usually a certain amount of certain width, and so things that happen within there aren't restricted in time, and they're kind of spread out in time sometimes. And so if the eyes are adapting to things like light, then that behavioral critical period can be affected. And so you can have a feedback between this M1 and B1, and that can be a cycle of contingency. So I just wanted to say that about contingencies, because I know we talked about this, but that's kind of what I was thinking about there. And so, this is a computational model, but I think this is useful for thinking about embodiment and contingencies, in terms of development, but also in terms of embodiment more generally. So now I want to get on. Now I want to move on to the stuff with project management for the week. And so in the last several weeks, I've been working on a course over spring term, and I've been developing this course, the lecture notes. And so I'm going to go very briefly into the lecture notes in the interest of time. And this is our Unit 4. So our Unit 4 actually is about project scope and types of contribution. So we already talked about that a little bit with respect to GSOC and GSOC proposals, and how you want to really define what you're doing. So, defining what you're doing is important, defining the scope of your contributions. And what we're focusing on in this section is how to make the optimal issue size. So an issue, I showed them ZenHub and how they use roadmaps and epics. And the roadmap is basically these issues that are spread out over time, and their dependencies between issues. So if you have an issue that's pretty poorly defined, it can affect not only the ability to complete that issue, but other dependencies. And so, this is, again, you have like things like like this photo upload feature, which is an issue. You'll want to break that down into multiple issues over time. So you might have dependencies like you have to have a camera UI. You have to request an API. You have to do these different things to make this photo upload feature happen. And you can use something like ZenHub to manage these things, both in time, on a timeline, and then in this epic, which is like a GitHub issue. And so defining the size of that issue is important. And so, I talked about roadmaps, talked about, deliverables, and how that's important in defining the size of an issue. So, the size of an issue is about the deliverable, but that deliverable is going to have a lot of issues underneath it. And it's going to, over time, you're going to sort of figure out how to build a set of issues that will help you get to that point of the deliverable. So I use this example of a robot. This is a therapeutic robot where, they've taken this idea and they've broken it down in this deliverable, and they've broken it down into a series of issues. And those issues then can be addressed, on a certain timeline, and sometimes there are dependencies to those issues. And then, you want to be able to manage that to get to this deliverable. And so, you have to have milestones. You have to have things in order, and they have to be done in a certain order and on time. So, different issues have to be synchronized. So to cook some soup, you have to open the can, pour it in a pan, turn on the stove, stir it up, and serve. And if you break that chain of dependencies, then you don't get soup, and you're out of luck. But fortunately, we know how this works, and so we can identify our resources, we can identify our risks, and that'll help us build a better workflow and a better set of issues to get to our endpoint. So there are a lot of trade-offs in issue creation. There's scheduling concerns, there are your objectives, and there are your priorities. And this is an image of Claude Shannon, who's an information theorist, the father of information theory, which we've talked about. He's actually not only an information theorist and a designer of robotic agents, but he's also a juggler. So this is him juggling all these things about, he's creating issues for his project, and he's dealing with all these scheduling things, objectives, and priorities. So, there are a set of trade-offs here. The priorities, if your priority is to make something, but you want to have certain features over others, you're prioritizing maybe cost or speed, that's going to affect the issues that you make and the size of the issues that you make. So, and the objectives, of course, if you want to make something that's a simple model versus a very complex model, that's also going to affect how your issue creation process works. And then your schedule, do you want to have it really fast, or do you want to, is time no object? That will also affect the issue creation process. So if you think of your roadmap, you go back to your roadmap and you think about this. A roadmap is basically issues at the systems level. So you have the system of issues, and they all interact, and they all have their own place in this timeline. And how do we make a set of issues out of this roadmap? We have basically a set of issues here. We just need to extract them. So, there are a couple questions you want to ask yourself for figuring out what the optimal size of an issue is. What do you want to achieve is the first thing. So, if you don't know what you want to achieve, you can't really create a set of issues of optimal size. And so think about this as a Rube Goldberg machine. And there are a lot of dependencies involved in this. This is a type of machine where you want to do a simple task like turn off a light switch, but you don't do it just by switching the light off. You build this set of intermediate steps that are ridiculous, but it just goes to show you that you can sort of abstract this process as a really convoluted mess of things. And so sometimes actually projects look like this. We have you think something is very simple, and then you get into the project and you find out there are all these things that are kind of in your way. And so these are the dependencies that are involved. And sometimes projects look like this because we live in a complex world. So it's best to recognize this complexity and play to that complexity in issue creation. And so then you also want to think about your time horizon. Do you want to do this quickly like a GSOC project, or you do want to do a long-term project like a years-long development process? And then what's your expertise? Do you have experts in the area? Do you have diverse expertise? Or do you only have a couple people, or maybe a single person doing everything? That will affect your issue creation process and the optimal size of an issue. So, the fewer contributors you have, the less process you'll need. You'll have fewer issues, but also less focus on issue creation and refinement. We talked about in another lecture where you have a bunch of communication channels, which often get, the discussions there often get fashioned into issues. Your number of communication channels go up, the number of people in your team goes up, the more issues you'll make. And issues are a consolidation of these communication channels and interacting project goals and needs. So, we want to be able to think about this in a way that's thinking about those communication channels, thinking about that process, thinking about the people involved, the number of people, and the expertise. Another way to think about projects is to have different issues and rank them in terms of like their plausibility, priority, and maturity. So, issues have a priority, what's most important, what's least important. They have a plausibility. Maybe something isn't very plausible. It's a good idea, but it's not plausible. Maybe something is immediately addressable and very plausible. And then some things just aren't mature enough to do yet, so you want to make them lower priority. And so you want to create a matrix where you can rank all these things, and it kind of helps you develop the optimal issue size and the optimal issues for getting to your endpoint. This is an example of that. So there's size, scope, and scale for issue attributes. The size of an issue is what is the amount of work that needs to be done. And one rule of thumb you could use is how many words does it take to define an issue? You can think of that as like maybe the semantic or syntactic content of an issue. And so, one thing you might notice is that if you have a very few number of words, an issue can be very vague. And if you have a long number of words, an issue can be very specific. But actually, that doesn't always work. Sometimes if you have a lot of words, it's very hard to solve an issue because you can't parse all the words, or, it's, you get bogged down to too much detail. On the other hand, if you have a very few number of words, you can't really address the core thing about the issue that's important. So, there's a lot of creep of concepts in both cases. And so you want to have, you can use the number of words, but that size is probably intermediate to like between 2 words and 10 words, The scope of an issue is what is the depth of the complexity? Are there a lot of dependencies, or does it require new things to be put in place? If you understand that, you can understand like what issues need to be there. Sometimes you think a process is really easy, and then you find out when you get into it that you need 5 intermediate issues. Knowing the scope in advance helps you to kind of get around that, and it saves you a lot of headache. And then scale, how long does it take to complete your issue? So if I say like, create a library of Notion documents, Jesse, I assign it to Jesse, and it's actually a very hard process to do because you need to plug in, or you need to, download everything one at a time. That is going to be like a mismatch of scale. I think it's going to take a very short, I think it's trivial, and it's actually not. So understanding the scale is also important. There are a lot of things here with issue attributes that and this is from this book, Program Management for Open Source Projects. This is a book that we use in the course as suggested reading. So there are a lot of things we can think about in terms of issue attributes. There's the problem, defining the problem, thinking about the type or version. So there's a description that, we can sort of sort the issue into a category. It might be a certain version, it might be relevant to a certain version, or it might be relevant to a certain topic. There's compositionality, so taking issues and placing them in a larger context. And then the status, priority, or impact, which is, is it urgent or not? Then there are the closure criterion. So what needs to be completed for an issue to be closed? Who needs to review and approve? And who needs to be aware of the changes being made? And so sometimes groups will have a public review of issues that is monthly or weekly. That can solve this. It can help people to clarify in their minds what the current and most salient issues are and what's been done. We just did this in the meeting with our conference stuff. What submissions are done and which ones are coming up and all that. And so making sure we understand who's responsible is also important. And then putting things in the timeline, putting it in the timeline in terms of its place, prioritizing certain things. So you notice that we had deadlines. We have a deadline in 2 days. We have a deadline 3 weeks out. The thing in 2 days gets higher priority. So that was lecture 15. And then lecture 16 is really, they have an assignment that I gave them that I kind of went over. But I'm going to talk about the first part of this presentation. So I talked about these different types of sort of project scales. And so the first one is this Earth shot. And the Earth shot is just basically, taking a trip around somewhere on Earth. And the idea is it's a very easy thing. So it's a simple issue with a simple solution. Examples of this are good first issues, which are often given to beginners in an organization, or some maintenance issue, which is actually just has a very specific endpoint and it's easy to do. And so an example of this is filling out a contributor form or checking out community resources. And so that's an easy first issue. That's an earth shot. You just travel from one place to another, and that's it. And this is a good first issue finder, so this gives examples of good first issues, and that was just a point of reference. Then there's some other examples of earth shot issues, very simple issues that exist. The second type is a moonshot. And so an issue can be broken down into multiple earth shots. So, you know, a moonshot is like where you take a bunch of these issues from like a board and you put them together. And so the idea of a moonshot is like back during the space race, you know, people were trying to get to the moon. And they did this, they tried to do this as quickly as possible. So they put a lot of resources into it. And they had these teams that would work on these, like just, you know, here, do this thing that seems impossible. And you put together a bunch of issues to get this to work. And then you put this together into a project that gets you to the moon. So this is you know, this is an example of this is where if I say I had a project where I said I'm going to write a simple numeric simulation, but I want to have a bunch of issues that help me facilitate this thing, make it reality. So I need things like code review, benchmarking, documentation, and maintenance. And all those points are just going to be issues in my board so I can accomplish this numeric simulation. And it's a moonshot. I'm traveling from the Earth to the moon. So this is an example of the board where you have these issues in these different categories, which is part of their assignment. They have to put different issues in different categories, create their own issues and put them in different categories. As you'll see, there's like to do, in progress, urgent, future goals, and done. And so they exist in these different categories. And you can, of course, move them around to different categories when you're reviewing the issues to make sure that progress is being made. This is, you know, making comments in an issue is important, of course. And this is one of the things I want to impart to the class. And then the Mars-Jupiter shot, which is where you have a problem that can't be broken down into multiple issues cleanly. Oftentimes it's where you have multiple sets of interlinked issues or projects not yet defined. And sometimes it involves multiple dependencies that are not yet defined. So in a Mars-Jupiter shot, we're trying to go not just to the moon, but to Mars and then Jupiter. And there are a whole host of issues that we don't really understand about that. A moonshot is similar to that, but you know, a moonshot is relatively easy compared to this, where we have this huge interstellar trip, and you know, it's hard to, or I guess it's it's intrastellar, but yeah. And so you know, this is maybe it involves landing on the moon and then going to Mars and then landing there and going to Jupiter, and so you have all these different issues that are hard to define and really kind of, you know, you have to get your head around the process to know what the full extent of all the issues you need to create are. You can't just create a bunch of issues that are supporting issues. You need to kind of break the issues down and kind of go from there. So one thing related to this is this idea of rescoping and issue revision. So there are two strategies here. One is to take an issue that is kind of vague and maybe, you know, you learn more about the problem and you find out that that issue is inadequate. So you might want to break that down into multiple issues. And so in one case, the original issue is too big. The objectives aren't clear. And so we break this down into multiple issues. The other strategy is lumping. So lumping is where you take multiple issues. Maybe some of them are near duplicates. Maybe some of them become, irrelevant over time, and you combine it into a single issue. And so this helps us to clear the decks and to make sure that that we're focusing on the right issues. And so this can be done by this process has to be accompanied by, you know, sort of a regular set of reviews where you're always reevaluating your issues. You have these best practices for optimal issue size. So I said, you know, you could use the criterion of like the number of words that you use to describe it, but you could also use other types of best practices. And then automation. Sometimes we don't want to create an issue for everything. Sometimes we can just automate a process and eliminate it from what we're doing. And so that can just, you don't need an issue for that. Sometimes you'll want to have issues that are continually renewed. So this issue has an end date, it has a status, but sometimes an issue you want to just keep, revisiting that issue as you do something. So it's part of a process. And so that's all part of issue creation and building, managing projects in terms of issues. So that's all I wanted to say about that. That was this week's course. So next week, okay. So we have Jesse had two thumbs up, and then I'm curious about Gantt chart options in 2023. I haven't looked up much, but they're coming out, softwares, etc.
Yeah, and those are all side things, but like I think I would very much like to, particularly lecture 15, also 16 is relevant too, for plot twisters. Like I think I might just show, like have people look at this meeting or offer to like kind of have a discussion session there at some point on those materials, because I think it'd be good for some institutional stuff we're building out. But yeah, I mean, there's obviously outside of that, this is super relevant, and at the highest levels of decision making in the industry and in research management and stuff like this is always, it comes down to these things in a lot of ways. Like how is things keeping track of who is being reported to? What are the time scales? Are those explicit? Do people realize they need to be coordinated about efforts at the different time scales? Like these are basically attempts to regulate and direct efforts and energies, and like there has to be buy-in and system and structure and predictability that people know what they have to do. Because if there isn't, like coherency and being able to speak or move in one voice or in one effort, like rapidly falls apart. Like when you get people with a lot of miscommunication or disagreement, like you have to find, you either have to have agreement, like in terms of consensus. This is coming up a lot in other places. Like who's setting the priorities? Is it there's a dictator? Is there an executive who's like, look, it's my choice? Or is it, a group of people? How do you get that? And sometimes, like one thing that I'll really highlight for people is that sometimes you, as someone who's not an executive, who's not a decision maker, have to bring up stuff and say, there is this clarity here. I need to find a decision maker and present the relevant stuff to them so they can decide, and then where the decision can be broadcast and adhered to. Like that's hard to do, and some like sometimes you don't. It's very. There's not a lot of saying, "Hey, here's how you do that." Like that's a very. There's channels or onboarding or shoot us an email if you have questions. Well, like how do you prepare an argument? How are you like doing it in a way that like defends your efforts and your times? Someone that I work with literally had to do, now that I think about it, this like literally this week did that because they were concerned that their superiors or the decision makers weren't aware of what efforts they'd done recently. So they basically had to just, hey, I'm doing a presentation on what I've done, and I hear the goals that you've laid out for our group. Here's how my efforts have done that, and here's my plan for what I'm doing ahead, just to show you that I know the time scale, I know the priorities, I know. Sometimes you have to do that. And for people in like Google Summer of Code, we're kind of doing that in a very handheld way right now. But like in the real world, sometimes no one's going to know that they have to do it except for you, particularly in things that are developmental or new that there's like less oversight with. So knowing how to bring up those conversations, knowing how to defend yourself And I don't necessarily mean like in a you're being harmed way, but like in a way to represent your value and your efforts and to contribute to it and to show that you're engaged. Like that's huge stuff. So yeah, I think this is a really good set of lectures, Bradley, and I'm happy to. I'm looking forward to kind of setting up. This will be let's reference this and other things in your course too. Like when we sit down and talk about some of the project management related stuff, like that session, this will be good fodder for that. So I appreciate you sharing it.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so this is very relevant to open source. In open source, you're doing a lot of issue creation, and there isn't I mean, you can have a leader, but like it's more about like people who are maybe doing something, and so I'm having them create issues of their own as individually in the class. So each person will create like a set of issues on a board, and then they'll create an issue through like there's a repository on the Oro group GitHub where I'm having them do this, where they have they have to create one through a form, like a pre-filled form, and then on a board. So you're creating them based on what you want to do. So a lot of open source organizations will have their contributors create issues on a board, and they'll say, okay, what do you want to do? What needs to be done? Sometimes you'll find issues that you can address. That's often something that open source contributors will do. They go to like a project, and then they'll go to the project board and find something they can do and then solve it. And then, in the EVORM project for GSOC, we have people who are, going to the project board and making pull requests and all this. We don't do that as much in these projects because we don't really have a lot of issues that we've defined in some of these projects. But still, this is something that you'll do as an open source contributor. You'll have to make your own issues, and you'll have to figure out what the right size is for that, or you'll have to solve an issue. And sometimes you can't solve the whole issue, so you just reference the issue and you say, this is my contribution to this issue. And it's not fully solved, but I'll tell you in the comments what I've done. And then it'll be up to the maintainers to say, okay, that's good, but we need this other thing. So we need to create a new issue. And so that's how, this sort of open source economy works, I guess, is on the back of these issues. And so, and then project management wise, even in other projects, you have I guess analogies to this. So like plot twisters, you have a lot of issues that you need to sort of enumerate and make sure that people are aware of what those are. And, this is a good way to do that. Yeah. So
yeah, I really like the what was it, managing it by priority, urgency, and maturity. I think that's a good ones to have.
Yeah, so that's a like a matrix that you can build, and if you go, I don't know if it's in this one or the other one.
It's in the other
15,
one.
okay.
15.
Yeah. So that's 15, and it's down here. This one. And yeah, plausibility, priority, and maturity. So, it's like plausibility is always like, what's more plausible? What's most plausible? Sometimes you have things that you just kind of come up with that are visionary, and you're like, well, I can put it in the maybe nice to have category. So there's this sort of way of thinking about it in Agile, where they have this process where you go through your issues, or you go through your features of your like prototype or project, and you say, what's a must-have thing, what's a nice-to-have thing, what's a should-have thing, and then what's maybe not-to-have thing. And so that's one way to think about plausibility and priority. And then maturity is your project mature enough to support this issue? And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. But there are all sorts of strategies you can do to make that happen.
I think explaining and not emphasizing, but just like when you are talking to stakeholders and decision makers, or whatever it is, whatever role of leadership, like being aware of those categories and being able to reference, I know this is at X maturity, or even if you don't know, being able to understand that you can ask, like, or try to find out, oh, this is that blank stage of maturity, and we're I think it's at this level of plausibility, but you think it's at this level of plausibility. How do we sort that out? Like like being able to have literacy and like having like agency or like initiative to have those conversations is like super critical to, especially if you're trying to actually push a project forward. Like that's you can't do it with you can't realistically do it without that. Like if you're at like an administrative or like a more seniorish level in particular, I think if you're just sort of passing by, it's easier to do it that way. But like it's really relevant to I don't know. I guess I'll say project leadership. But at the end, we can move on. I'll let it be.
All right. So yeah, that's good. So thanks for the comments. So you actually asked a question earlier about Gantt charts, and so there's another thing that we might want to talk about here called Wardley maps. So Wardley map. This is not project management so much, but this is actually a map for business strategy. This will become relevant in a minute. So this is a type of map that was developed by Simon Wardley. This is a technique he created in 2005. And then, it's basically, it allows you to position components within a value chain and it's anchored by the user need with movement described by an evolution axis. So it's sort of an evolutionary approach to, there's, I guess, project management if you're building a product. So this is an example here where you kind of diagram this out, think about it, and then you put it into this diagram where it's value on the y-axis and commodity on the x-axis. So you have this user need, so it's like range of drones, and then can I deliver there, going up in value, user need. And then going forward from can I deliver there in commodity is location identifier. Is there stuff? Can I deliver there? Is there stuff? Stock depots? Where can I fly? No fly zones. And then product info, whether that's like from the range of the drones down the commodity axis. So that's how these diagrams are structured. It's sort of thinking about the problem and then the evolution of that problem. So this actually does relate to issue creation in that, you're thinking about this thing and you're using these criterion to kind of break down the problem. And, it gives you these value chains, which, are just on these two axes. So the reason I bring this up is because this is something that was circulating on Twitter, I think, where people were creating these Wordly maps of AI. And so in this case, this is AI. This is much cleaner than the one I showed you before. This is the two axes here, the value chain, invisible and visible. And then this other axis is, I guess, evolution, which is where you go from the genesis or the concept to an emerging technology to a converging technology, which would be converging on a product, to something that's a commodity that's accepted. So it's basically this sort of maturity curve that you see with hype curves and the maturity of the product. So, it's just another way to state that. And then you have this value chain going from invisible to visible. So this is called AI Knowledge Tasks. This is from this month. This is version 1.1. This is computing. So this is like quantum computing, which is way down in this corner. Invisible and conceptual. FPGA, which is a converging product, but it's still invisible. Invisible, I guess it means it's that layer that you don't think about when you think about AI. It's like the processing units. GPUs and TPUs are now accepted. Again, we don't think about them too much, but they're like the common currency of the field now. FPGAs are coming up, and then quantum computing is off into the future. The same thing with foundational models. You have multimodal models, which are emerging, You have LLMs, which are converging neural networks, which are converging, so large language models and neural networks. And then Markov models, which have been around for a long time, which are accepted models. Then you have model training, so RLHF, which is reinforcement learning with human assistance. That's kind of emerging. You have reinforcement learning itself, which is sort of in this emerging category, coming to converging, and then unsupervised learning, which is in this converging category. And then you can go up from there to the different levels of visibility. So, this is, I guess, I don't know what JTBD is, but practice, I guess, is where you put AI models into practice. It's either tactical or strategic. And we talked about one of the models where they were using it to play Risk, which is the strategy game. So that is something that's emerging, but tactical uses are converging. They're more commonly used in products. And so, we have all these categories. I think it's interesting because we talk about knowledge maps, and then we talk about, like we've talked about, hype curves and things like that. It just kind of fits into that discussion. Then there's one specifically for large language models. So this is where, again, you have the compute layer, which is actually, in this space from FPGA to CPU. And then you have the architecture, which is the convolutional neural network to tokenizer to multimodal. You have different things like transfer learning, fine tuning that goes to foundation models, which is, goes from embedding model to GPT-3. You go up to the ecosystem where, who's using it, basically. For research, it's actually an emerging technology. For industrial labs, it's more of a converging product. So it's kind of an interesting take on it, And then, engineering practice, generative AI, Chat GPT, Stable Diffusion. There are different levels of development. Trust, knowledge tasks, and adjacent possibles, which are, I guess, like the space of innovation. But this is really kind of an interesting map because, we've talked about large language models, but not really in this way. So, and then it's, again, part of that conversation. So, yeah. So I can, make those available to people if they want to look at it. Yeah. So that's Wardley maps in that space. Also, okay, so yeah, I have a new preprint out. This is the thing that was submitted to BICA, which is the Cognitive Models Conference. So this is a paper called Super Performance, Sampling, Planning, and Ecological Information. And it's this idea that, you have different types of performance across the animal kingdom. You have some organisms that are very good at sampling their environment, and some organisms are very good at planning. And so this can be summarized in this parable of the person who's trying to catch a fly. So if you've ever tried to catch or swat a fly, you can't really do it very easily. So you need a lot of hand-eye coordination and luck. And that's your planning abilities, it involves muscles, it involves thinking. But the fly actually is faster because they're sampling their environment at a much higher rate than you are, at least their visual environment. And so this paper talks about that, and breaks this down into super planners and super samplers, and looks at the differences in those two strategies and how that relates to what we call Gibsonian information, and how you can have this as an optimal trade-off. But sometimes some types of performance or super performance exists in this relativistic regime where there's elements of both super planning and super sampling. So this trade-off breaks down and you get these relativistic regimes. And you not only see this in animals to some extent, but you also see this in technological systems. And so I kind of lay out some of these methods that we might use, like information aliasing and information moments, and this idea of coevolutionary super performance. So using adversarial agents to get a sense of the dynamics of this competition between super performers and super samplers and super planners. And so then, kind of talking a little bit even about augmenting human performance and how we can get to that relativistic regime in human machine systems. So that's something that I've been working on actually for a while. I came up with that idea like several years ago, actually 10 years ago. I wrote a blog post about it, and it was not very well formed at that time. And then I revisited it in 2020, and I think I talked about it with Avery and Jesse in Chicago when we were there, and I worked on finishing it up. So that's there.
Yeah, very cool. I look forward to taking a deeper dive with it.
Yeah. So okay, so yeah, now I wanted, I guess, to move into papers unless we had anything else we wanted to discuss.
I'll check. I think that's it. I'm gonna look at the Notion thing. No, that's all I had on the list. So I think good.
Okay.
Yep.
Did we have any questions from anyone before we move on? Okay. Well, again, you can put things in the chat if you have questions. All right. So actually get into this set of papers, calling this folder Diverse Forms of Learning, Memory, and Representation. So this is a series of papers that have come out in recent times on different topics in these areas. So, they've been kind of mounting up, kind of keeping them aside and not presenting them. So this is going to be kind of maybe wide ranging, but hopefully it'll be useful. So this first paper is Perspective Learning, Back to the Future. This is from the Future Learning Collective, and the identity being hidden, but I know that it involves Conrad Cording and some other people. And I'm not sure if they actually define who the Future Learning Collective is, but suffice it to say it's the usual suspects in the neuromatch area. So the abstract here reads, research on both natural intelligence and artificial intelligence generally assumes that the future resembles the past. Intelligent agents or systems, what we call intelligence, observed and act on the world. So there's this sort of uniformity hypothesis about intelligence, that there's this future, that you can predict the future from the past. So it's like, with like a regression model or a linear model, you're predicting things as like kind of this distribution of independent events. So you have a bivariate graph, you have a distribution of points that you observe, this, you draw a regression line, and then that regression line allows you to predict, for different regressors. So for, whatever you're trying to predict, you're trying to predict Y based on X. So I have this model that's basically these points, and this line will tell me, what Y should be from X. So I should be able to do that. But the problem is that when you think about that in time, it's basically you have to assume that the future is going to be like the past, that this distribution is invariant, essentially. And then that's not really the way, you can do it in different ways, but that's what they're arguing here. So that's that kind of approach, the regression approach. And so, a lot of these people have, been involved in things like Bayesian models, which are different. And the assumption of a Bayesian model is where you have, a current event, and you have a distribution, which is your you have like a prior distribution. And so that prior distribution is like the history of things, you have to pick a prior carefully. Then you have a set of observations, which is, of course, another bell curve. And, that can be, we can debate on what that should look like, but those are your observations. And then you integrate you compare your observations with their prior You go with a posterior distribution, which is maybe something, well, let me get this in line a little bit more, which is something a little bit more, it adapts, the prior basically adapts to the observed, and that allows you to predict. And, you can use a posterior to update your prior. And it's like when people say updating your priors, that's kind of what they mean. That you find something in the observed set that is, unexpected relative to the prior. So you're generating a posterior that can update the prior. And there's a time component there. So it's like, your prior is the past, your observed is the present. Your posterior is a prediction of the future, but then future observations will change the posterior and change the prior, and you can go through this loop endlessly if need be. So, the generally Simpson uses this experience to act on future experiences of the same kind. We call this retrospective learning. So what they're saying here is, aside from what I've just told you, that the future resembles the past. Okay, that's retrospective learning. So that's like basically learning from the past and then assuming the future will be the same. For example, an intelligence may see a set of pictures of objects along with their names and learn to name them. Correct. But now the objects have to be static, the names have to be static. And so once you learn the names, that's all you need. But of course, if those change over time, then the learning becomes out of date. A retrospective learning intelligence would merely be able to name more pictures of the same objects. We argue that this is not what true intelligence is about. In many real-world problems, both NIs and AIs, natural and artificial intelligences, will have to learn for an uncertain future. Both must update their internal models to be useful for future tasks, such as naming fundamentally new objects and using these objects effectively in a new context to achieve previously unencountered goals. This ability to learn for the future is what we call prospective learning. We articulate 4 relevant factors that jointly define prospective learning. There's continual learning, which enables intelligences to remember those aspects of the past which it believes it will be most useful in the future. So they're defining continual learning as basically this Bayesian view. 2 is perspective constraints, including biases and priors, which is, of course, from the Bayesian model there, where you have biases in your prior, or you have prior distributions which constrain your ability to see the future. This facilitates intelligence finding general solutions that will be applicable to future problems. So the idea is that you can apply a constraint in a way that's positive, that you can constrain you can update your prior based on current observations, but a lot of changes is not necessary to really get a good model, a general model that will allow you to see the sort of any possible future. So sometimes, the environment changes, it fluctuates. If you update your prior based on current observations, you can miss the big picture, basically. 3rd is curiosity, which motivates taking actions that inform future decision making, including in previously unmet situations. So that's kind of like creativity. And then causal estimation enables learning the structure of relations that guide choosing actions for specific outcomes. So it's like estimating causality and estimating the consequences. We argue that a paradigm shift from retrospective to prospective learning will enable the communities that study intelligence to unite and overcome existing bottlenecks and to more effectively explain, augment, and engineer intelligences. So they are calling for a paradigm shift from retrospective to prospective learning. So that's that paper, and that's something I think it's a good lesson for a lot of what we have been talking about with respect to learning and respect to statistical models. The second is this paper on the evolution of representation in simple cognitive networks, and this is from the journal Neurocomputation. This is Ren Hinsey and Christoph Adami, Lars Staller. Christoph Adami and Ren Hinsey do a lot of artificial life research with respect to like brain evolution and evolving like these what they call Markov brains, which are these really interesting artificial intelligence brains that you can read about if you're interested, but we're not going to talk about that directly. Actually, I think this is what they're going to reference in this paper. So, so the abstract reads, representations are internal models of the environment that can provide guidance to a behaving agent, even in the absence of sensory information. So you don't need sensory information if you have representations according to this view, but those representations are going to be based on past information. The sensory information will give you an active update to that, but you can use representations to, just kind of internally to process things. So they're arguing, they're approaching this from an evolutionary standpoint. They're saying it is not clear how representations are developed and whether they are necessary or even essential for intelligent behavior. We argue here that the ability to represent relevant features of the environment is the expected consequence of an adaptive process, given a formal definition of representation based on information theory, and quantify it with a measure R. To measure how R changes over time, we evolved two types of network, an artificial neural network and a network of hidden Markov gates. This is their Markov brain that they refer to here, to solve a categorization task using a genetic algorithm. So if you're not familiar with what a gate is, this is a logic gate that you're using, and it uses a Markov model to model the operation of that gate. So this differs from a neural network in that you're basically addressing this as a binary problem, and it's a binary network as opposed to an artificial neural network, which is, it's a set of units, but there's a continuous activation function, and the weights then are the thing that you're communicating. So they're using two different approaches here. Then they're going to solve a categorization task using a genetic algorithm. We find that the capacity to represent increases during evolutionary adaptation, and that agents form representations of their environment during their lifetime. So they can use this artificial life environment, a genetic algorithm, to evolve representations in these different brains, and they can actually evolve form representations during the lifetime of the agent. This ability allows the agents to act on sensorial inputs in the context of their required representations, and enable complex and context-dependent behaviors. We examine which concepts, features of the environment our networks are representing, how the representations are logically encoded in the networks, and how they form as an agent behaves to solve a task. We conclude that R, as this parameter, should be able to quantify the representations within any cognitive system and should be predictive of an agent's long-term adaptive success. Okay, so they've proposed that you can measure the formation of representations, and they're important in evolution. So this one actually is interesting. It's a little bit different approach here. This is spatial computing for the control of working memory. So this is a little bit of moving away from like the artificial intelligence, although maybe not. This is about spatial computing and working memory. So the abstract reads, working memory, or WM, allows us to selectively remember and flexibly control a limited amount of information. Earlier work has suggested WM control is achieved by interactions during bursts of beta and gamma oscillations, and those are oscillations that you can measure electrophysiologically in EEG data and so forth. So this is working memory as like a neural signature of it. The emerging question is how beta and gamma bursting, reflecting coherent activity of hundreds of thousands of neurons, can underlie selective control of individual items held in working memory. Here we propose a principle for how such selective control might be achieved on the neural network level. It relies on spatial computing, which suggests that beta and gamma interactions cause item-specific activity to flow spatially across the network over the course of a task. So this is where we're looking at what they call spatial computing, which is this where you have these this flow across the network of these different types of interactions. So that they actually have this spatial computing. I don't know if there's another definition to this, but I'm not really familiar with this approach. This way, control-related information about, for instance, item order can be retrieved from the spatial activity independent of detailed recurrent connectivity that gives rise to the item-specific activity itself. So this is an interesting point about working memory. Working memory is really about holding things in a memory for a limited time. Like if you're trying to count numbers, if I told you count from 1 to 10, and you would have to count, you'd have to like recall that like this is the order of our numbers, right? And you know this in long-term memory, you learned this when you were a kid, but you need to know, you have to kind of reference the order. And so to reference the order, you have short-term memory. And so working memory or short-term memory is usually thought of as distinct from long-term memory. And it's this memory bank that has a certain capacity to it. And the capacity is controlled by these neural signals, or these bands of neural activity. And I don't know like how they're mapping this in the study, but they basically have this network where they're able to show that there are these different functions. So you need to figure out the order. And then in the paper they talk about, so this is, let's see, item-specific activity versus sort of the item order. So you have to figure out the order. And then there's as a activity associated with recalling that order, putting that order together, recalling it from long-term memory. And then there's item-specific activity itself, so counting across those numbers, and then having that as your like capacity limit. So these are two different things, and you can have, you have to have different processes, and these processes interact, and then this is what they're measuring. The spatial flow should in turn be reflected in low-dimensional activity shared by many neurons. So this is the spatial flow of things across the network should be reflected in some sort of low-dimensional activity, meaning you don't have to extract it using a dimensionality reduction approach. We test predictions of the proposed spatial computing paradigm by analyzing control-related as well as item-specific activity in local field potentials, and neuronal spiking from prefrontal cortex of rhesus macaques performing working memory tasks. As predicted, we find that low-dimensional activity has a spatial component from which we can read out control-level related information. So this is low-dimensional activities flowing through the network. We can kind of infer what kinds of control there is, it's going on in working memory. These spatial components are stable over multiple sessions and did not depend on the specific working memory items being used. We hypothesize that spatial computing can facilitate generalization and zero-shot learning by utilizing the spatial component as additional information encoding dimension. And this offers new perspective on the functional role of activity that tends to dominate cortical activity. So this is about like brain networks and working memory, and how brain networks within working memory mechanisms, there's signals that interact, EEG components. There's also this aspect of flow across the network, and then that's all sort of indicative of low-dimensional artifact, low-dimensional measurements that you can actually infer the control of this working memory mechanism. Okay. So then there are two additional papers here. Both of these are sort of more, well, this one actually isn't anatomical so much, but this is again with brain networks. This is about looking at the whole brain and neuronal connectivity. This is about heavy-tailed neuronal connectivity arising from heavy and self-organization. So when we say heavy-tailed, we mean that you have these power law distributions that you often see in non-normally distributed data. And so we can look at this as like a log-log plot, which is where it's like this. Or we can look at a linear plot where, the data are plotted like this. In both cases, you have this sort of long tail. So this is the long tail here. This is the long tail here. And so basically the long tail is the part of the distribution that has, a lot of rare events in it, or have a lot of low frequency events in it. And so, it's very long because most of your things that you're measuring are part of the distribution as opposed to things out here. And that's usually indicative of like things, non-normal performance, like, where you have a lot of units that are doing one thing and only a few units that are doing something else or something like that. So the long tail has been of interest in complexity theory for a long time, but you can also look at neuronal connectivity as being this heavy-tailed phenomenon. And so this sort of signature of neural connectivity, it's usually indicative of like hierarchies of, having hubs in a connectome, for example, where there's control centers in the connectome. Those are heavy-tailed phenomena. So those hubs are in this part of the distribution here, where they have a few things doing something else. And so this actually arises from Hebbian self-organization, and that's what this paper is about. So the abstract reads, in networks of neurons, the connections are heavy-tailed, with a small number of neurons connected much more strongly than the vast majority of pairs, which is what I just said about these heavy-tailed distributions. And they could be hubs or something else. Yet it remains unclear whether and how such heavy-tailed connectivity emerges from simple underlying mechanisms. Here we propose a minimal model of synaptic self-organization. Connections are pruned at random, and synaptic strength rearranges under a mixture of Hebbian and random dynamics. So when they say pruning, they mean that there are a lot of synaptic connections, and the synaptic connections can be they're always maintained through different mechanisms. And what happens a lot of times in developmental learning is that you have pruning of these synapses. So you start with an overproduction of synapses, and they get winnowed down through this pruning process to something that is optimal in terms of performance. So that the overproduction of synapses leads you to seeing, having a lot of sensory inputs, a very wide range of sensory inputs. And then over development, this gets winnowed down to an optimum. So this is the kind of thing they're talking about with respect to pruning. You can prune them at random, and then you can measure the synaptic strength afterwards. And the idea is that there's this mixture of Hebbian and random dynamics. So Hebbian is this idea that if you have two neurons that are connected through a synapse, the synapse has a strength over time, and it reinforces the activity of that synapse. If there's no activity between the two neurons, and that synapse is not active, then that synapse dies. That's what Hebbian means. It's basically this reinforcement of synaptic connectivity. And then the random dynamics means you just prune things at random. So you pick a random algorithm and you say, just, prune this thing, don't prune this thing. And that's, as you might expect, maybe less efficient. Well, we'll see. Under these generic rules, networks evolved to produce scale-free distributions of connectivity strength, which means scale-free means no distinct number of connections per node, which means that, every neuron has a different number of synapses, roughly. So networks evolved to produce scale-free distributions of connectivity strength with a power law exponent, which produces that long-tailed behavior I showed you. It depends only on the probability P of Hebbian rather than random growth. So this is the probability of Hebbian growth. That's a parameter we're interested in. By extending our model to include correlations in neuronal activity, we find that clustering, another ubiquitous feature of neuronal networks, which are networks in the brain, not neural networks, also emerges naturally. We confirm these predictions in the connectomes of several animals, suggesting that heavy-tailed and clustered connectivity may arise from general principles of self-organization rather than biophysical particulars of individual neural systems. So what they're saying is that Hebbian connectivity or Hebbian rules shape the formation of these connectomes and the hierarchical structure of these connectomes. We see this in multiple real actual connectomes, and this is something that is not a random process because we can look at a random process and that doesn't work as well as a Hebbian process. So that's an interesting paper. And then finally, there's this paper on building transformers from neurons and astrocytes. And so transformers this is going back, I think, to our AI interest here. And now we're talking about building a transformer, which is a certain type of machine learning. And we're doing this with neurons and astrocytes. So usually we do this with neural units, but now we can actually do this with, I guess, biological neurons and astrocytes and see. So this is actually from the IBM Watson IAI lab and MIT, the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences. So glial cells account for roughly 90% of all human brain cells and serve a variety of important developmental, structural, and metabolic functions. So glial cells are known as support cells for the neurons, but they're connected to the neurons metabolically, but also informationally. Recent experimental efforts suggest that astrocytes, a type of glial cell, are also directly involved in core cognitive processes such as learning and memory. So astrocytes, I guess they're going to cite this work, but there actually is a role for astrocytes in information processing. And so not just in, well, the learning and memory requires metabolic support. So while it is well established that astrocytes and neurons are connected to one another in feedback loops across many time scales and spatial scales, so you have astrocytes supporting different neurons. There's feedback loops between the astrocytes and the neurons. The activity of neurons reinforce the astrocytes, and the astrocytes reinforce the health of the neurons, and so forth. And there's information flow as well. There is a gap in understanding the computational role of neuron-astrocyte interactions. To help bridge this gap, we draw on recent advances in AI and astrocyte imaging technology. In particular, we show that neuron-astrocyte networks can naturally perform the core computation of a transformer. So a transformer is a type of machine learning, and they kind of talk about transformers in the review here or in the paper. They talk about the similarities between transformers and the hippocampus, and this is like just a way the transformers actually, they use this to model attention in machine learning models, but there are a lot of core computations that the transformer produces that are have biological similarities, and so that's where I think where they're going with this, and they're using a real models of the brain to sort of show that. So the core computation of a transformer, a particularly successful type of AI architecture, so they don't really talk about too much here, but in doing so, we provide a concrete and experimentally testable account of neuron-astrocyte communication. Because transformers are so successful across a wide variety of task domains, such as language, vision, and audition, our analysis may help explain the ubiquity, flexibility, and power of the brain's neuron-astrocyte networks. And so a little bit more on transformers. A typical transformer block uses 4 basic operations: attention, feed-forward neural network, layer normalization, and skip connections. These operations are arranged in a certain way so that the entire block can learn relationships between the tokens, which represent the data. So what they do is they take the data, they turn it into tokens, they tokenize it, and then they have these blocks that learn relationships, and then they use these basic operators: attention, feed-forward connections, layer normalization, and skip connections. And then this can be like, language, or it could be images or whatever. So in the language domain, tokens correspond to words in a sentence. In the image domain, tokens correspond to portions of an image. And so people have suggested that there are similarities across, between the transformer and different biological structures, and, even with human brain recordings. And then, so transformers are only beginning to be interpreted in terms of their biological processes. Other neural networks, there's been a longer tradition of thinking about the connections there. And so what they're basically doing is they're constructing a neuron-astrocyte network whose output approximates that of a transformer with high probability. The main novel computational element of our network is the tripartite synapse, the ubiquitous 3-factor connection between an astrocyte, a presynaptic neuron, and a postsynaptic neuron. So this is a tripartite connection. So you have the presynaptic neuron, the postsynaptic neuron, synapses, which are sort of in this area. They're going to be here. And then you have this astrocyte out here, which is connected to both of them. So the astrocyte is spatially diverse with respect to this synapse. It manages both neurons upstream and downstream, and thus it's managing the synapse as well, or the existence of the synapse. It's mediating it in a way. So that's where we're, that's the kind of computational kernel that we're using for this. We show that tripartite synapses perform the role of normalization and the transformer self-attention operation. As such, neuron-astrocyte networks are natural candidates for the biological hardware that can be used for conducting computation with transformers. And so with that, I'm done with the papers. And I thought that was a pretty whirlwind tour of these different papers, but hopefully you found that useful. And I think the last paper was especially interesting.
Yeah, please share them as you do. I'm recording them a bit in the in Notion. The last one and the first one in particular, like I think I want to take a deeper dive into, because the first one's the paper with like a lot of neuromatch people and the learning from discovery or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Over time, something that looks good. And I'm particularly curious about the astrocyte stuff in the sense of I want to understand, a goal of mine is to understand a bit more about like the glial, basically all the support, quote unquote support activities of the glial cells, because I feel like there's some important things I need to take from that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess people are trying to feel their way through different sort of ways to model the brain, and of course we talked about like the sort of the original intent of connectionism that comes from like the McCullough-Pitts neurons, and how they basically just modeled the neuron, and the McCullough-Pitts neuron is more biophysical than like a connectionist neuron, but they focused on the neurons. And there's a lot of stuff in the brain, like astrocytes and glia and things like that, where it's doing things that are modulating a lot of these connections. So we've talked about synaptic connections, we've talked about dendritic computing, and other alternative versions of neural computation. And then this is another one in that category, in a different category that, it would be interesting to follow up on. So we had.
Did you want to say any more about that, Amanda?
I don't think so. I think I have to wrap my head around the details a little more, but I can tell that I at least understand it enough to know that it's interesting regarding that distinction between like digital encoding versus analog representation.
Yeah.
I have an adjacent question that could be a very long thing, but I just want to ask a question to get some immediate feedback, and we can talk about it like Wednesday or something. The question is, analog versus digital, or maybe not even versus, like moving between them, is essentially an issue of mapping between different mediums. That's a statement. How true is that statement? How would you critique that statement? Like between mediums or between formats?
I think it's really a matter of sampling. So in the paper, I was doing the super performers paper, there's this issue of sampling. So you can sample things discretely, which means you acquire maybe 1,000 images per second or 1,000,000 images per second. And then there's this aspect of putting it together. So like in visual systems, the organism will sample the environment at a certain rate. And then there's a fusion frequency, which is usually where the sampling rate matches like some sort of continuous ability to see. So like you don't notice it in your real life, but if you were to sample the environment much slower than your fusion frequency, then you would see the world as a series of jump cuts. And it's really hard to like get your head around, but basically the sampling rate of your visual system is it's sort of evolved to sort of match that frequency, that fusion frequency. But if there's stuff going on in the world that's much faster than that, you're going to miss it. Or if it's much slower, you're not going to see the detail of it. So it's like there's this aliasing that goes on. And so I would say that like a continuous strategy and a discrete strategy, or an analog and digital strategy, are sort of part of the same thing. It just depends on how you're sampling the environment, and how that's being represented. So I don't know if that makes it any clearer, but but I think that's a different. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Is like, yeah, it can be discrete until it's continuous, and there are different ways that can be done, especially perceptually.
So this this is yeah this is many bridges. Like, insert here now. Let's take a turn into second order cybernetics and how the role of the observer affects the sampling rate and whether or not someone can, what their levels for discrete versus continuous management is.
Yeah.
There's also, I was pretty convinced by a few papers that I read that argued that there's more to the analog digital distinction than just continuous versus discrete.
Okay.
Talking about like the I don't know, going back to like the clock metaphor, a digital clock displays numerals, but an analog clock, as time passes, there's a like one-to-one kind of transition in the thing representing the time. And that can be discrete or it can be continuous. You can have the second-hand ticking, or you can have it moving smoothly. So I think that's relevant here too. Like, obviously discontinuity and continuity are essential parts of those concepts, but I think there's something more going on.
Yeah.
I want to basically, I think the start of Wednesday, we'll just like review this conversation.
Yeah.
And build up. There's just so much that's tied to all of our stuff here.
Morgan, did you want to say something in closing?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, really interesting papers, and I think a good recurring segment of the lab meeting would be to give us this week to ask questions next week.
Oh yeah.
Because but I mean, I would love to return to these papers and have these follow-ups because they are just so interesting and they bring up so many interesting questions.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, if people want to do that, that would be great. I know there's like, we have some continuity there sometimes, but not enough, I think, to like kind of get into a topic. And so, yeah, if we can like, maybe we can start to categorize some of these approaches, like, in different ways and kind of get,
I think I'm going to put a call for like science communicator, assistant lab manager or something, who would basically help me record this in Notion, facilitate it for next week, and maybe put some of the stuff online. I think that's a little bit more manpower in that area, or person power in that area would be very helpful, because there's a lot of the twirly bird threads that we can build a little bit more. I think Morgan's great to see you again, Morgan. I think that's would be something that would elevate the depth of the discussion in ways that would be useful for everybody. So yeah.
Would it be
Also,
possible to just? Oh, go ahead.
No, you're good.
I don't know when, Bradley, you choose what papers you want to go over, but sharing them just like a day or two ahead of time.
Yeah.
So that anyone interested can read them and prepare questions.
Yeah.
I personally would find that useful.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it's ad hoc, but
yeah.
I mean, we can definitely revisit it the following week, which, if we want to put it in Slack.
Usually they're just so interesting, it does take a week to dig into them.
Yeah.
But I like both ideas.
All right.
I'd like to see that list.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's great. Any other questions before we go or comments?
Yeah, I saw Pratham and Vrushali were maybe going to say something, so I wanted to make sure you guys had time to speak too if you wanted to comment.
Okay, first I'll start. So I'm really glad to be part of this today's meeting, especially the last segment where we went through all the research papers. That was amazing. I got to know about several new things, and yeah, the last paper was really interesting for me. Also, uh, uh, I learned a lot, and yeah, I also wanted to probably ask regarding the meeting if you're arranging with Rajagopal regarding the GSOC. I would be particularly interested in joining that meeting because I found the switching between tools for Mesa I could be of a really help right there if possible. Because I have familiarity with doing so in my previous works. Yeah, that's it. And thank you for having me as a part of the meeting. And,
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, thanks for attending. And we can get in touch about the MISA tool. That's just something that has come up recently, so we'll have to follow up on that. But yeah, it's an interesting approach to agent-based modeling. You know, it's there are a lot of things that are nice about NetLogo, but like it has its limitations, especially when you're building big models or putting them on the web. So MISA is probably the best tool that like you can use that's not NetLogo, and for things like that. So, Vrushali, did you have anything you wanted to? Any questions or comments? Okay. All right. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, you can check it out. Check out the YouTube video later, and I'll put the readings up in the Slack with the talk or with the meeting. So thank you for attending. Talk to you on Slack. See you next week.
Yeah, thank you. Talk to you soon.
All right, talk to you soon. There's Jesse's meme there.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Take care.
Take care.
thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.